So you need a computer that will be budget friendly for right now, but also something that will be upgradable for when you have some more cash in the future. And in my opinion, you basically have a couple of options for this. The first option is something like this. Now, this would be your typical, now this is just an example. This one is $500, but you can go cheaper. So this one, for instance, is a Core i3, which is a 4-core CPU, 10th gen, a 1650 4 gig, and an SSD, and probably like 16 gigs of RAM. I'm not sure about the RAM, but regardless, it doesn't really matter. This is not a great price, but it's just an example. Now, the other option with something like this would be something a little bit older, maybe something, I'm not sure if we're going to see it in this list here, but something more like this. Something that's also a 6th gen. It doesn't really matter, it's just a little bit older. You can even go as far back as maybe a 3rd gen or a 4th gen, and something that has, let's say, a 1060 in it. Now, this is the first option, and these are basically just older, more budget PCs. But then you sort of have the argument of going, okay, well, should I go for an old GPU, something like a 1060, a 1050 Ti, an RX 570, an RX 580 maybe even, or should I consider going for something like this? Now, this is on the opposite spectrum where you don't have any GPU at all, and this is basically just going the APU route. So what that means is the GPU is embedded in your CPU. Now, these embedded GPUs are not as strong as dedicated GPUs, and they do make use of unified RAM, and so they don't necessarily have a lot of available VRAM, but they are useful in terms of budget gaming. I'm not saying that these are as strong as a dedicated older GPU, but that's not the point I'm making. The point that I'm trying to make is, should you consider getting something like this because it's a much stronger system otherwise, away from the GPU. And this one specifically is the same price as this one, and it's not even on sale. But you have a third option, which would be this. And this is the same thing. It's also an APU, but it's a small, oopsie, didn't want to do that. It's a small form factor one. So what that means is it takes a lot less space. It's a lot less intrusive. This one specifically is a lot newer and makes use of DDR5 RAM and a much better APU. And so this would be akin to a much stronger graphics card than maybe something like a 1070. I'm not sure exactly. We will try and see some tests for that. But the point is just something like this is an out-of-the-box sort of solution for budget gaming. Now, if you're just going to be doing esports, this might be fine. For AAA games, it's still not quite there, but you do get low refresh rate, low frame rate gaming with something like this. And of course, now with the prevalence of external GPUs becoming such a big thing, this might be something to look at, especially if you're limited on space. So option one is get a system that is a little bit weaker, a little bit older, but a little bit cheaper. Now, this is a bad example because this one is expensive for what you get, but limit yourself in terms of upgradability, either because the platform is getting old, so that might be AM4. Now, that applies to this as well. Or just you're going to have to spend another $400 to get a GPU that is actually really good. Or go the route of having a no GPU, but better parts, and then down the line buying a GPU for this setup. Now, this is not the best example either because it is DDR4 and it is a AM4 system. Let's see if we can find an AM5 system. With Intel, this problem doesn't exist yet, but it will next year when they launch their next platform. Yeah, I'm not seeing anything specifically, but you get the point. So the sort of argument would be, should you buy this? And use it as is for a while, get a better GPU down the line. Buy this, use it as is, get a better GPU down the line, but you have better parts, but your gaming performance for now is going to be much worse. Or get this, it's a little bit cheaper and it's limited. You can't add a internal GPU, but if you have the money down the line, you can spend some money on a GPU enclosure and get a better external GPU. Or if you're someone that just wants to play exclusively budget, low refresh rate, low graphics games, esports games and such, getting something like this might be a good solution. So with that said, those are the sort of options. Now, this specifically is maybe even too new of a system to make the point that I'm trying to make. I would say maybe something that is still DDR3, something that is locked to an older platform, and maybe something like a 1060. But this is not a bad example. It's just this one is still relatively modern. But with that said, let's see how the APUs will stack up against this system, and whether it would be worth your time to invest in an APU versus a GPU. Let's do it. So first up here we have the first PC that we looked at, the 1650 PC, versus the PC we looked at that does not have a GPU but is a integrated APU, but it's the normal form factor one, so the ATX one. And this is sort of just a showcase to see between them. And then next up we will have the performance of the other PC, the little box one, which has a 680M graphic chip versus a 1650. Now, of course, the 1650 is going to beat these chips. That's not what we're looking at specifically. We're trying to see by how much it beats them. So right off the bat here, and just for reference, both of these are running the 5600G and they have 32 gigs of RAM, so it's same spec. So this is only focusing on the GPU. The CPU in the first system we looked at, the one that is a normal form factor APU one, is better than the CPU in the 1650 PC, but this test is just for the graphics, so we're going to disregard that, considering that the two PCs cost more or less the same. So first up here we have Apex Legends. Now, right off the bat you can see that in Apex Legends, the first PC, the APU one, is getting about 85 FPS, and the second one, which is the 1650 dedicated one, is getting around 30 more, 40 to 30 more, 30 to 40 more at around, well, it spikes as well, but it does get more. It gets above 100, is sort of the point. So it's a big advantage there. Let's take a look at CS2. And I'm not sure which settings it's being ran at, but both settings will be the same, so we can sort of just nullify that. And in CS2, the Vega 7 5600G is also at around 85, and the dedicated 1650 is at 210, so it's a much better performance, almost 3 times as much. Or actually more than 3 times as much in some cases. Cyberpunk might be a bridge too far for the APU, so you can see here the APU is running at 22 FPS, but even for the dedicated CPU, and this is sort of where I'm making the dedicated GPU, the 1650, this is sort of where I'm making my point. Some games now are going to be too powerful even for a 1060 or a 1650 or a 580 or a 570 or maybe even a 5500 XT. And so it might be better to look at getting something like this, where it's not going to run well, but you know that you are future-proof in the rest of the hardware. So by the time you save up enough to get a dedicated graphics card, it would be something like a 6700 instead of a 1650, or maybe a 3070. Something that will actually run these games well, and at that point you have a 6-core CPU that is able to keep up with that GPU. That's sort of the point of this video. Let's take a look at one or two more here. I think Fortnite would be a good one, because these are the kind of games that are marketed towards these APUs, right? Because these are mostly the games that kids would play and that people would buy APUs for, because they are more affordable for the most part. So Fortnite is getting around 100, and not too much better on the dedicated GPU, maybe around 30-40% better. GTA 5 is another prevalent one, and 60 on the APU, 150 to 200 on the GPU, so much better, but both are playable. And that's sort of the point I'm making. In fact, the time frame, time frame line for the APU is actually much smoother than the GPU, and that's a problem that GTA has at points. Hogwarts Legacy. Now again, I'm not really looking at the settings, as long as the settings are the same. 40 FPS to 60 FPS on the APU, and 80 FPS to 110 FPS on the dedicated GPU. So the theme is that the GPU is 2, 3, maybe even 4 times better. But the point that I've made already is it's not really about how much better the GPU is, it's about how much better the GPU would be that you could eventually buy to add to a system that now has specs to match that future GPU. And with that said, I probably wouldn't even be looking at a AM4 CPU for that, because you would want something that is future-proof, and that would be AM5 at this point. I'm not going to look at any more of these, maybe Red Dead quickly. So Red Dead would be tough because of the VRAM limitations of an APU, and so you can see there 20 FPS as opposed to 70 FPS, and that's because the 1650 has a 4 gig of VRAM capacity. And so that makes my point. There's some games that you just aren't going to be able to play on an APU, and this might be one of them. But as with Cyberpunk, you won't be able to play that on a 1650 really either. So let's move on to the newer one, the one that is more prevalent to this video, and that would be the Radeon 680M, and this comes with the CPU that we had on the small little form factor PC, which if the thing with this one is, if you want to upgrade the GPU on that one, you would have to get an external GPU, which would obviously lose some speed, but it might be worth it in some capacity. Now the CPU on the little PC is obviously AM5, and it comes with a 680M Radeon chip for graphics. And it also comes with DDR5 RAM, which is much faster. For this test, I'm not sure which CPU it uses, but they are all the same, and they all use 16 gigs of RAM. So the 680M, which is the one we're looking at, now this would usually be a laptop chip, and the 780M versus the 1650 laptop and 3050 laptop. Now, of course, the 3050 is going to outperform these, and the 1650 is going to outperform them as well. But this kind of shows that, and this is running, and this is important to remember, because this is running at 1080p high settings. And so we're not in that same ballpark as the 5600G. We are in the next ballpark where we can actually run these games at respectable graphic settings. Now, of course, 30 FPS is not really that playable, but if you do lower this to medium, I'm sure you could get 35 or 40. And the 680M is just the example we are looking at, but there's also the 780M, which is even better. I'm pretty sure you could get above 50 at low settings if you play games on the 780M. Cyberpunk is still going to be a little bit hard for these. This is running at medium, but this kind of makes my point again. You know, on the and this is a good example of looking at the best case APU versus the worst case GPU. Not worst case, but worst case for these examples, because some of these GPUs will be older than the 1650. It might even be a 750 Ti that you get on these PCs on Amazon that are the same price as the APUs, and that's kind of the point of this. So the 1650 laptop GPU, of course, versus the 780, it is going to be around the same performance in a lot of games, and that's very interesting. Now, I know we are looking at the 680, but this is sort of just a general speculative talk that I'm having with you. And yeah, this sort of makes my point. So the 780M, the APU chip, runs Assassin's Creed, which one is this? Assassin's Creed Valhalla, medium settings 1080p at 41 FPS. And these tests just show me that, you know, it's the best case APU is as good as the worst case GPU at least, but in some cases it makes more sense to have that because you're talking about a lower power draw, you're talking about a lower footprint, lower form factor, smaller form factor, and just future upgradability. Now, of course, with this one, you lose a little bit of that because of the form factor, but it's not like these chips only exist in the small form factor. You can still get these on ATX sort of platforms. Let's take a look at a few more. So, Red Dead Redemption, still not really all that playable, and again, it might be a VRAM issue. Not too bad on the 3050, but comparing these to a 3050 seems very unfair because a 3050 would be a lot more expensive. A 3050 costs more than the entire system that the APU is running on in some cases. Lastly, Horizon, same thing. It's VRAM. Games that need a lot of VRAM is just going to be a bridge too far for these things. Now this is running at high, so if you turn it down to low, I'm sure you could get 45 playable frame rates. But yeah, to sort of just finish up with this, it's interesting to me, the results that we have here. And of course you need to remember that if you buy more RAM, you will have a better result because it makes use of RAM to sort of get those texture unified sort of memory systems going. And so it's going to be a better result with more RAM, but it'll be playable even with 16 gigs. Now, 32 gigs of DDR5 or 48 gigs of DDR5 is not really necessary in such a small form factor PC, but if you do have a desktop variant, it might make sense. And of course, then you have that capacity to upgrade to a dedicated GPU down the line. And in the meantime, you will still be able to play games. Now, I'm not talking about the small form factor one right now. Of course, you do have that choice with the external GPU, but that's not something I would necessarily do. There are use cases, but that's not what I'm talking about specifically. I'm talking more about having a motherboard with a fifth gen Ryzen, well, not a fifth gen, a AM5 Ryzen CPU, and one that is maybe a 12 core, and you have 32 gigs of RAM, and you have a GPU that is equivalent to a 1650. Then down the line, you spend another $400 and you get a 3080 or let's say it costs that much at that point. It's not really relevant. Alternatively, you buy a system that is locked to either the AM4 or current Intel platforms. So you get locked to whatever capacity that has. Then you have the 1650, but the PC costs a lot more. Probably in some cases even twice as much. And I mean, you still have the capacity to upgrade the GPU down the line, of course, but you are locked to an older form factor, not form factor, but an older platform. And that's sort of the point of this. So if I'm talking for myself, if I find something that has a 780M APU in it, and the CPU is good and the RAM is good and it's fast and it is current gen, I might go for that above something that has a dedicated GPU, but it's older, it's slower, and there's not much room for upgrades. But on the other hand, if the price of the current gen one that has no GPU is the same or similar to the one that has a GPU, I might still go for the GPU one, because you're not gaming in the future, you're gaming right now. So it really depends on what you want to do, but it's an interesting time where we actually have options, which is not something we had before, and there are actually choices to be made in regards to these things. And it's interesting to see, and I think it's a good time to sort of be in gaming. There's a lot going on, and there's a lot of choices to be made. People are, NVIDIA is being pushed by AMD, Intel not so much, but the innovation is at an all-time high in my opinion, and it is a good thing that there are more choices. So you won't really go wrong with either, but you just have to look at your situation and what works for you, and sort of see what makes sense in your current predicament. I hope you enjoyed the video. This one was a bit long, bit rambly, but I enjoyed speaking on this, and I hope that you will stick around and that I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching. Cheers.